Good morning, everyone. We're going to wait for additional folks to get logged in. While we do that, I'm going to go over some of the logistics of working with GoToWebinar. You're in the listen-only mode. All attendees come in the listen-only mode. You can toggle back and forth if you're having audio problems with your computer. You can toggle back and forth between using your computer audio or using the telephone functionality, and you can find that in your little control panel on the right side of the screen. If you have questions, and we encourage questions, ask those throughout the presentation. There's like a chat box, but it's titled questions. You can put your question in there for Steve or any of the folks, and we'll do a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. If for some reason we run out of time or we don't get to all the questions, or you think of something later, there's my email address, kwinge@momainstreet.org. You can send me questions afterwards, and we'll help get you those answers. All right, Gayla, are we ready?
We are ready. Good morning, everyone. So glad to have you guys again. Hopefully we have some new folks that hasn't joined our mornings on Main before. And hopefully we have a lot of friends that have been following us as we continue to do these. So it's been a month since our last one. Doesn't seem like it, but it has. I feel like we've kind of been in hold for about 4 or 5 months, haven't we? But we've missed you all, so we're glad to be able to kick off this next webinar today. But before we talk about today's webinar, I just want to make an announcement about the next webinar on August the 5th. Kristen Borgstrom owns Place Main Advisors and specializes in working with Main Streets and community leaders effective communication strategies. Her work has not only been vital during this pandemic as Main Street communities have become informed information hubs, I should say, for their businesses as communities, but also has been crucial in creating exclusive community-led revitalization. Join us on Wednesday, August the 5th, same time, 8:30, mornings on Main, and learn a lot more strategies that we can bring into our system and our daily work, as you guys, many of you all are leaders out into the community to help us through today and hopefully into the future when this pandemic is behind us. But as many of you all also probably heard the name Borgstrom, yes, it is Mrs. Borgstrom. We've always had Mr. Borgstrom before, but many of you all that have been at national conference before probably has heard Kirsten give presentations before. So we're excited that she will be joining us as well. So again, thanks to everyone for joining us, but a special thanks to Steve and Christine for putting this webinar together for us this morning. We really appreciate it, and kicking off our monthly webinars now. So I just want to give a little bit of a shout out for Christine. Christine is one of our board members here at Missouri Main Street, and she's just a phenomenal lady. I have what I'm supposed to talk about, and I am going to talk about what her real job is. But Christine is just, like I said, she's an incredible lady. She inspires us here at Missouri Main Street. She's one of the first ones to always come back and make a comment when we're doing something good and great out in the community, and also encouraging us to reach out to particular different people that we have not met and partnering with. So she's always at work for Missouri Main Street. So her heart is with us. So Christine, thank you for everything that you do for us as well. Really, really appreciate it. So Christine leads a team of accounting professionals to provide audit and tax and consulting services with a focus on commercial real estate and industry. She specializes in guiding develop and economic development organizations through available incentives and financing to support real estate projects in affordable housing and historic preservation projects. She has been an active member, of course, for Missouri Main Street on the board for 3+ years. So welcome, Christine, and welcome, Steve.
Well, good morning, Main Street friends. I'm just so glad to be here with you on this lovely hot July morning, or what the weather's like wherever you are. It's truly my pleasure to be here today and get to share this presentation with my colleague, Steve Etcher. a little bit about MarksNelson. We're a certified public accounting firm and advisory firm, and we love to help our clients safeguard and grow their business. We like to deliver individualized on-point strategies and help you with opportunities, even tapping into national resources when needed. We love to build and maintain trust relationships with all of our clients and help you meet your goals when you work with us. Moving on to the next slide, please. There we go. Here's a little bit more about our firm. We're the 8th largest firm in Kansas City, and you can see some of our statistics about that. And we just love working with our clients. We have a couple of specialty niches that we work in, though we serve clients from many industries. Real estate is one of our largest niches. Construction, we also work with manufacturing folks and folks in the insurance industry. So Steve's one of our premier folks in our real estate area. It's my real pleasure to introduce him to you as our presenter today. Steve Etcher is a manager in our Location Strategies division. He is a veteran, a professional and practitioner consultant, and helps his clients work on economic development, community planning, transportation planning. He's a grant writer and administrator. He works with folks on their hazard mitigation, various communities. He's a practiced and well thought of author and speaker. So it is my pleasure today to introduce you to Steve Etcher, who will take away our program here. Of course, we have a little disclaimer about the information we're presenting today. So Steve, may I give the program to you? Thank you.
Well, thank you, Chris. Thank you, Keith. Welcome and good morning. What a beautiful Missouri morning today. What a beautiful summer we're having. I'm delighted to be able to be with you today and to share this information with the Missouri Main Street Connection and its members. I hope that as we go through this presentation, there's a nugget of information that's shared that will help you not only with your business, but also with your communities. And I'm sure we've got a mixed audience of business owners and community organizations on the line. So I hope the information shared will really have some application to both audiences. But I think I'd be remiss if I didn't just start by saying 2020 has been a very interesting year thus far. It seems like we've been in this mode for months, if not years, but we're really midway through 2020. What we've seen in 2020 so far is our vernacular has changed. We're now including terms in our daily conversations like social distancing and self-quarantine, pandemic, COVID, stay at home, and a lot of other elements and words that not only changed our vocabulary, but they're really changing our way of life and our way of doing business. And my hope, my goal, my aim is to change the narrative. And I really would like the following words to define our lives and our businesses and our communities, and words like resilient and robust and remarkable. That's really what I want people to remember 2020 to be about, and what they want to recognize our communities are being able to do, and that is to be robust and be resilient. And so hopefully with what we share today, that'll help you and your communities just do that, become resilient communities and really robust economies for your citizens that live there. I think many of you have seen the description of what we're really going to try to talk about today. So I'll just kind of give you an overview of what we're going to talk about today, so you kind of know when to nod off and when to wake up as we kind of go through this presentation. But really what I want to focus on today is just the basic steps that communities and businesses should take to prepare for and withstand economic disruptions, because economic disruptions are likely, if not predictable and probable, during a business life cycle. Some disruptions are minimal and brief and only have a small impact on the community and the businesses, but others are very major disruptions that have a lasting impact or even a fatal impact to businesses and communities. So the hope of this webinar is to guide you as the local organizations and local businesses to really understand some of the essential elements that you need to consider and prepare for as you think about the disruptions that are likely. This is not intended to be a comprehensive guide to business continuity or business succession or even community response. Those comprehensive approaches are very detailed and tailored specifically to a community and to a business and to a situation, and really making sure the end user gets what they need out of that. And there's not enough time in the webinar today to really go through that level of detail, but do know those are important elements that you need to be considering. Our desire today is really simple. The three things we'd like to have happen today. Number one is to increase the awareness of the need for being prepared for the unexpected. And then to provide some basic information to help you guide your businesses and your communities in anticipating and preparing for these unprecedented and unpredictable events. And then to share some best resources and some best practices with you to make the process that you go through for planning and preparing a little bit more manageable with the time and the limited time that you would have to do that. So most businesses and communities know the big risks that can impact their lives. But unfortunately, it's often the unthought of or the unexpected risks that cause the biggest disruptions. And I personally think a global pandemic kind of fits into that box of things for many of us that, yeah, we know it's out there, but we really didn't expect it to come to bear, to have an impact on our lives and our community. And it's also very likely that your community leaders have also identified the universe of risk that are likely in your local community, or at least the natural risk that could impact those specific communities. Many counties and many communities in the state have already developed and adopted a natural hazard mitigation plan. These plans are actually a prerequisite to qualify for a lot of federal future disaster aid. And these are incredible plans for you to get your hands on. These plans identify risk and risk areas within a community. They identify resources to respond immediately to the disaster. It lists out for you the responsible parties that will be in charge of leading a response activity and response efforts. And it suggests strategies and resources to help communities deal with hazard mitigations that are there. These plans are available at your county level. They're updated every 5 years, but they can serve as a great building block for you as a community organizer or as a business interest to really get a good glimpse of what are some of those hazards out there that have been thought of, and what does our community have to deal with on a daily basis. So what are some of the natural hazards that really occur in our state? Many of you have probably seen a lot of these events. You probably experienced a lot of these events. But Missouri has its fair share of natural hazards. We have the risk of tornadoes, which we have seen, everything from EF0s to EF5s roll through our state on a number of occasions. We've seen the incredible damage that they can cause to a community, and it seems like just a couple of years ago that we were really dealing with the aftermath of the Joplin tornado, and the hearts still go out to those businesses and those families that were impacted by that. But tornadoes are a real threat here in the state. Fires and wildfires are things that are often seeing more and more recurrence in our state. Snow and ice, which obviously snow and ice does not even enter our mind as a threat today, but during the wintertime, they can have a real significant impact on business operations. High winds, hurricanes, you would think a state surrounded by 7 land masses would not be subject to the threat of hurricane. But I remember back to 2008 when Hugo comes storming up through the Gulf Coast and dumped literally dozens of inches of rain on parts of the state of Missouri. Hurricanes can have an impact on us, and we need to be prepared as a community and as business to accommodate that. Flooding, I've had much more than I care to experience in terms of responding to flooding disasters. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't even mention earthquake as a threat, since Missouri is home to the New Madrid Fault. So in Missouri, we get to experience all 4 seasons, but we also get to experience a host of natural disasters that kind of come along with that. And unfortunately, we have experienced many of these in our lifetime, some to a lesser degree, some a little bit more high profile. Some may affect a broad area, and some may affect only isolated areas. But if you're the one that's impacted by that, it becomes a serious disruption. And it's a disruption that you need to be prepared for, so we can make sure your business survives and your community survives, and the residents have a quality of life within their community. But there's also some non-natural disasters, non-natural risks that communities and businesses are exposed to on a daily basis. Some are severe, but oftentimes these are overlooked when you start thinking about disaster preparedness and preparing for the unexpected. You kind of think only of the natural hazards. But financial crisis could be an element that has a great disruption to your business, whether that is with the stock market plummeting and a lack of consumer confidence, which impacts sales within the local communities. Or it could be bank closings. I'm old enough, they called me a veteran, but what she really was trying to say in the introduction is I'm old. But I remember the bank closings in the 1980s and how that just rocked communities when those financial assets were frozen. Pandemics, it's interesting, it's always just been on the list of hazards to consider, but we really didn't give it a lot of credence. But I do think it's going to elevate its consideration as we get through 2020. Cyber attacks are a very real threat to businesses and communities. Supply chain disruptions, labor stoppages, industry sector downturns can have a devastating effect on certain communities. We were working with a very unfortunate community, had a very large industry in their community. That industry employed about 60% of the regional labor force, and then they closed up. They were purchased through an acquisition, and through that merger process, that the entire community's employment sector plummeted. So having that downturn in a specific industry could have a real significant effect on your communities. Succession of ownership, you wouldn't think of that being a disaster, but there's nothing like a feuding family to disrupt business operations as normal. And as that business is interrupted, obviously the employment is interrupted, and the impact to the community can be very, very real. War and acts of terrorism, I think we can all vividly recall September 11th and how the world just seemed to stop for a number of days while we watched that unfold. And then we got to, endure and work through the response and the shock that had to our economy as well. Power interruption is a very significant hazard that needs to be considered. We are very power dependent as communities and businesses. Everything that we do is run by some power source. And then lastly, you need to consider technology failures. What if my technology is a hardware issue and it fails, or there's a software issue and it's not operating? Or what if there's a loss of my data, or what if my data is stolen? These are all very real risks that have a significant impact on businesses. And as you think about preparing yourself to withstand these types of shock, you need to make sure you have a plan to deal with those specific elements. And we'll talk a little bit about today what a community can do and what a business should do in kind of an introductory mode to continuity planning and business succession and community preparedness. But what can a community do to prepare? And I believe the single greatest thing that a community can do to minimize economic disruption is to plan. And I know that doesn't sound like a very dynamic word, but having a plan is so important to recover and withstand an economic disruption. You need to plan for the impact, and we've already talked about identifying the known risk and the projected impact that risk could have upon your business and your communities. You need to understand who the vulnerable population is and who those vulnerable entities are. These may be individuals or businesses located in a high hazard area, or it may be a specific population that is dependent upon employment within a specific industry sector. So know who the vulnerable populations are, because those are individuals and entities that will need your immediate attention. And then as you're starting to plan for that impact, you'll identify the things that you're most susceptible to. Begin to undertake mitigation efforts that will at least minimize, if not avoid, the impacts that could come from that. Some mitigation strategies that I would just throw out there for you to think about if you're a community is really looking at what are your risks are. And maybe you need to look at economic diversification so you're not so dependent on a single industry sector. Maybe you need to make some infrastructure enhancements to kind of safeguard the public infrastructure to support your community, your businesses. And maybe you need to provide some educational programs in terms of making the public, making the businesses aware of the impacts in the high hazard areas that's within your community. Then you need a plan for the response. Now, if something does happen, what are you going to do? And this word probably sounds extremely overused and extremely simplified, but I think as you plan for the recovery, the best thing you can do is educate yourself. Educate yourself and your managers or your employees on what's available out there to assist you through the response. You're not going to be going through this alone. Likely there will be other businesses and communities going through the same thing. So there's going to be a toolbox of resources at your disposal. Know who's responsible for each of those response elements and know what they can provide to you, either as a business or community. You also need to communicate in advance of an event. And I believe that the communication should be continual with your response personnel, whoever that might be. That may be your county or local community emergency management response agency. It might be your chamber of commerce. It may be an association in your community. But know who's kind of the go-to persons for response, and let them know what your situation is at all times so they can help you most effectively. And then know who and know what resources are available to help your business and your communities respond. I think one of the best practices that I've seen is to develop a economic disruption resource guide. This is a best practice that really has great benefits, but this is something you do before you use it. You prepare it before you need it. That way, when an event happens, you can pull this information out and know exactly who to talk to respond to a specific need that you might have. And then lastly, in terms of planning for the response, I would encourage you to engage. Be part of the team that's involved in the planning of the response and the recovery, so you can develop meaningful resources. You as a business owner, you as a community organizer, if you've ever been through an economic disruption, you know what a meaningful resource will be. And it's very important that you help those planning and response personnel understand those needs. Then after the response, you need to also plan for the recovery. Understand that the recovery is going to be a long-term process. It's going to be residual way beyond the immediate disaster response. After the cameras and the front page headlines have gone away, you as a business, you as a community need to be planning for that long-term recovery effort. Know what resources and partners are there to assist you and support you in your recovery efforts. And like I like to tell a lot of communities and businesses is communities don't succeed without businesses, and businesses don't succeed without people. So as you plan for the recovery, make sure you're taking care of the people, whether that's the citizens of the community or the employees of your business. Make sure you're taking care of the people. So what should businesses consider when preparing for the unpredictable? I believe the starting point really begins with two key questions. What are my risks? I need to evaluate what my risks are. And what is most important? How do I prioritize what I need to protect? If the goal is to achieve the greatest resilience, the highest probability of business operations continuing beyond a disaster, for the least amount of effort, you kind of have to develop a strategy, because you can't address all of the concerns and all the hazards that are out there. So you have to understand what your risks or most vulnerable impacts are, and then what is most important for you to continue. The construction project right down the street that cuts your fiber or telecom line is probably going to be as disruptive for you as an earthquake could be, because it basically breaks your lifeline to the business community. So you need to understand that some risk can be minimized and mitigated pretty easily. Other risks may be of such great magnitude, but such low probability that it's too expensive to mitigate. There's no practical return on that investment. So just understand both the severity of your risk and what's most important for you to really address. Resilient businesses and resilient communities, they just don't wish those risks away, or they just don't say, well, if it happens, we'll deal with it. They understand them, and they take practical, cost-effective measures to mitigate them. There's some key questions that I think a business should ask themselves. What are your key business functions? What is it that we do that's important that if it was disrupted would have a ripple effect throughout our business structure? What does that business function produce in terms of revenue, and how much support does it give to other functions? Unfortunately, I've seen businesses focused in on protecting certain processes and products that make up a very small amount of their overall revenue package. It had little impact on the overall business function operation. They just had their priorities shifted onto the wrong things. So understand the most important elements that your business has to provide, and then respond accordingly. Know how the various functions of your business interact with other functions as well. You may have a process that only employs a few people, but it may have a supply line to the rest of your plant, for instance. So you could have a disruption through the entire operation. So kind of know how your business functions and begin to prioritize those, and know how that they kind of build upon each other. Understand what your prime season are. I know I'm probably speaking to a lot of communities with small businesses. There may be a lot of small business owners on there. So you kind of need to understand when you're most vulnerable, as well as what you're most vulnerable to. Many retailers make their biggest profits, November and December with holiday sales. A lot of bed and breakfast and tourism industries really rely on the summer market, summer weekends to really produce their revenue for the year. And accountants are, busy from February to April with tax filings. So you'd really hate to have a pandemic hit you in February through April. That would be just horrible. But yeah, those are things you have to prepare for. You need to understand what you're vulnerable to and when you're vulnerable to those hazards. The other thing that a lot of businesses really fail to recognize is what are the vulnerabilities of both their vendors and their customers? How well do you know them, and what are they vulnerable to? Are they located in a floodplain? Do they have an aging ownership that is only a matter of time before they go through that transfer of ownership and that disruption? Do you have customers and or vendors that's teetering on the edge of bankruptcy? As a business, you need to know who you're doing business with, both on the vendor side as well as the customer side, so you can be protected and be prepared for things that might impact them as well. The questions that you can ask yourself are endless, but really it's important to identify what you feel as the business owner, as the community representative. What is our greatest risk? What has the greatest disruption potential in our community? And what can we do to prepare for that, plan for that, and respond to that when it happens? So how to plan. This is going to, again, sound very elementary, but if you develop a plan, keep it simple. I believe in having plans that are very actionable, very goal-oriented. To have a 3-ring binder that's 3 inches thick with all of your details sitting on a shelf somewhere, probably it's not going to help. But neither is just keeping a mental note of what we're going to do in the event of a disaster, in the event of some sort of disruption. So you need to kind of make sure that process is clearly articulated, clearly written, so others can follow it in the event of a disruption. That plan really can be written on a few pieces of paper. I mean, it can be on an index card or the back of a napkin if you want, but I believe prepare it so it can be circulated and shared with key people. I think that plan should identify the risk and identify your priorities. That really identifies the safety and health concerns that you as a community and you as a business are likely to face. That plan should identify and project what resources that you will need to respond to in the immediate aftermath. You also need to think about your facilities and your communication and your network. Can you operate in a remote location if necessary? Is there an alternative location in the event of a flood or in the event of fire or in the event of an earthquake that you can quickly ramp up and deploy? The plan should identify what records are vital for your business operation and succession, especially computer files. Everything's digital. There's opportunities for you to have those records available everywhere. So identify what records that you want to maintain and make sure you secure. You also need to figure out and identify what specialty equipment do you use in your process, and where can you acquire that replacement equipment if needed. And is there other vendors that can provide that if there's a disruption to your normal supplies as well. You need to look at your supply chain. Where are you getting material from that goes into your processes? And if something happens to that, are there alternatives? In the event of an economic disruption is the worst time to try to figure out who else you can acquire products and services from. So do the homework in advance and make sure you have that. Also create a communication plan. I think it's so important as you begin the response, you know who you need to communicate with. And there's certain information certain individuals will need to have. You need to have a communication plan with any of your employees that you have. You need to have a communication plan for your customers and your suppliers. And most importantly, I think you need to have a communication plan for your bank. We have seen that in this current pandemic, that a lot of banks just were kind of kept out of the loop until it was almost too late. So understand what each one of those audiences need to know and make sure you're communicating with them. But I would add this caveat to that is have an alternative way to connect with those that you need to communicate with. It may be very likely during a disruption, your normal means of communication may not be sufficient. The email may not be working, or the phone lines may be down. So make sure you have alternative ways to connect with those that are critical for you to communicate with. A question that many businesses wrestle with when it comes to pandemic planning or disaster planning and response is what do I need to insure? What are the levels of insurance that I need to have? And grappling with insurance coverage is kind of fundamental to modern life, not only for individuals and communities, but for businesses as well. And insurance is a cost-benefit formula. You need to understand what it's going to cost and what benefit it's going to provide so you can make an informed decision on what coverage you need, what are levels of deductibilities, and what specific event coverage do you want to have on your policies. You need to make sure you have a very knowledgeable and trusted insurance provider to help walk you through that process. Most policies you can add on protections for hurricane and flood and earthquake, windstorms, etc., even power disruption. But you can also think about having coverage for business interruption or service interruption in case there's a loss of electrical service, or if there's actions by a civil authority, such as the government issuing a stay-at-home order, which would limit access to your business, or maybe even contingent business interruption insurance, which would cover you in the event of one of your supply chain providers experience a disruption. So there's a lot of levels of insurance that you can consider, but seek out good counsel from a trusted advisor to make sure you've got a cost-effective insurance solution. We've already talked about this, but really identify your supply chain risk and develop alternatives. That is something a lot of businesses don't give enough thought to. And I think as we've gone through 2020, we've seen the vulnerability of our supply chains, and we now know how much we need to reshore a lot of those materials so we can have more immediate access to them. Another key area that a lot of businesses struggle with in terms of keeping up with is understanding what records I need to maintain and where do I maintain them. It's very, very important that you maintain business records. Keep a duplicate site, preferably off-site or in the cloud. I mean, there's no need having a backup of your hard drive sitting in the filing cabinet right next to the server room. If there's an earthquake, a fire, a flood, or an event that impacts that facility, you're not going to lose your source data, you're going to lose your backup data. So make sure you're really safeguarding your information. I think the key records really should include, most importantly, your employee contact and your employee emergency contact information. Make sure you know how to get a hold of your employees and their employees' family members in the event of any kind of interruption. Make sure you keep a copy of all your insurance policies, particularly off-site. If you had a fire that destroyed your facility and your only copy is located in the desk, you're going to have a difficult time retrieving that information. Make sure you have your bank records in a location that you can access them when you need, along with all your financial and accounting records. Most of the recovery really starts around what is your financial need. And if you don't have historic or current records, both in terms of your financial operations and your tax obligations, it's going to be very, very difficult. So be proactive and make sure you've got those records maintained offline. I also try to constantly encourage businesses to understand that the response is long-term. Resilient communities and businesses, to get there, it's a marathon and it's not a sprint. It will require ongoing efforts and the ability to both be flexible and adaptable to the environments around you. And if you kind of think about the continuum of response to an economic disruption, there's really three key time frames. You've got the immediate, that short term, which really focuses on the response, kind of the triage effect. Make sure your facility is safe, make sure your staff is doing well, really kind of do that immediate response. What has been the impact? How do we stop the impact from spreading? How do we get control over that? So you have that immediate response that's really focused on safety and security and staff. Then you'll have an intermediate response, and this will take weeks to months. The first phase is typically days, hours to days, sometimes to weeks, but it's very, very short term. Then you get into the immediate response. We start focusing on recovering your business operation, recovering your community, re-entry into the marketplace if you've been offline because of a disruption, whether a fire, earthquake, flood, act of terror, whatever, coming back online, re-entering the marketplace, restarting your processes. If you're in the manufacturing business or you're in the service sector, restarting that is part of that intermediate phase. And restarting sometimes takes a tremendous amount of capital resources. If you have to resupply your inventory, stuff like that, you need to have a plan for that restart. And it also would include rebuilding. If there's been a destruction of a facility or something of that nature, intermediates where you kind of do that rebuilding And I think you'll all recognize that that intermediate phase can really drag on for months. And that is an element that takes a tremendous amount of energy and a tremendous amount of resources. And usually about the time a business owner gets to the end of the intermediate, they're exhausted. They're done with the pandemic. They're done with the disruption. They're done with what they've been dealing with. But the work is not done. There's still the long term that you need to consider. And that is really focusing on restoration, whether a relationship or customers or suppliers. You're restoring your business back to its original production capabilities or beyond. You're creating stability within your business. You're taking lessons learned from what you just experienced and preparing yourself to withstand that and withstand that even better than you did this time. But a lot of times they're so exhausted after that intermediate phase that they kind of forget to go into that, okay, I've got to focus on a long-term strategy here as well. So as you're developing your plan, I would just advise you and encourage you to look at that continuum of response. So when a disruption does occur, do you really know what next steps are that will increase your chances to survive? Do you really know what information you need and where to locate it? If the response to COVID-19 is any indicator, the answer in most businesses is no, they do not. They do not know what they need to do. They do not know what resources are available. They do not know what records are important. So as a result, the response and the recovery is going to be even more difficult. So I think we can use that as an opportunity to figure out how do we respond better. Three things that I think that as I've looked at the more recent disruptions that we had, three things that I think I would want to stress with you today to kind of put on the forefront of your mind is obviously, first of all, have a plan. If you don't have a plan, please immediately develop a plan for your business so it can succeed. But in that, the three things that I thought were very, very lacking in some areas, but very beneficial to those that had it, was actively and proactively communicating. You need to communicate with your bankers, with your local response agencies, with your employees, with your customers and vendors. Things will likely be chaotic. If it's chaotic for you, it's likely chaotic for others. Don't wait for these key partners to reach out and communicate with you. Take the initiative, reach out and communicate with them. In the pandemic, we really saw a lack of communication with financial teams and finance teams, the bankers, etc. And that really hurt a lot of businesses' ability to respond to the immediate relief programs that were out there. Secondly is educate. And I know I've stressed it early on, I want to stress it again. Understand what resources are out there, investigate, start asking questions, talk to your neighbor, talk to your fellow businesses, talk to your association, talk to advisors within your community to know what's out there, know what the public is going to do in response to when there's an issue that comes up. And then enlist those resources and those organizations in your community that are there to help you recover and respond. That could be, associations, it could be the small business development centers, it could be a network of core members, it could be, Main Street Connection, it could be a chamber of commerce. There's countless others, regional planning commissions, state programs and services. A lot of resources are out there to help you survive and thrive after an impact. So reach out to them. And then thirdly, make sure you're gathering the critical information, information that you will need to have at your disposal if you want to really take advantage of and make yourself available to the recovery programs that are out there. And those records really are your financial statements and your tax records, your payroll and your employee information, and your insurance coverages. Make sure in the event of a response, you have those three critical pieces of information at your fingertips. So we talked about once the recovery is done, once you've done the triage, once you've done the re-entry and reestablish your business organization, you kind of into that post-disruption phase. And this phase is where a lot of people kind of stop. They're just exhausted. So some things I would encourage you to do in the post-recovery phase, in the long-term strategy. I do believe these things are critical and they need your attention. The first would be replenish spent resources. It's amazing what a disruption will consume. They usually consume things in great magnitude, much more than in a normal business operation. So inventory what resources were spent and replenish them as soon as you possibly can. Update all your records. The records that probably will change post-event are your financial statements, your tax records, your bank records, your debt instruments, but it also can change your employee count. It might change your vendor relationship. It might change your customer relationship. So update those records and keep those records as updated as possible. Verify post-pandemic that you are keeping a redundant copy of all those vital records. Just because you had them for the first event, don't let your guard down and let that lapse. Make sure all of that redundant information is stored in a secure location for the next event, which is likely to happen. And then lastly, I would say communicate. Again, reach out to your customers, your employees, your vendors, bankers, let them know your status. Hey, we're back in business. We have reopened. We are restoring our capabilities. We want to be here to meet your needs, serve your needs. We want you to be our faithful employee as well. So communicate your status and capabilities with all of your shareholders and stakeholders so they really understand that you have survived the pandemic. So in the few minutes we have left before we open up for questions, I just want to share a few things that I've experienced in COVID-19 that hopefully will help us in future disruptions, because I believe life gives you teachable moments, and it's what we learned from 2020 that I think will help make us a more resilient state, more resilient communities, more resilient businesses. So some observations that I thought were notable, and this is obviously not a comprehensive list, but it's important. Family impact has a business impact. It was interesting to watch that people prioritize the safety and well-being of their families even above the need to provide for their family. So as an employer, you need to understand what your employee's motivation is, and that is to take care of the safety and well-being of their family. That is the utmost priority for most people in this COVID-19 environment. 2, employees are very loyal to their employers for the most part, but they are scared. They're uncertain. There's trepidation out there. And what we have found is businesses that demonstrated concern and provided good information and resources and solutions to their employee had the greatest level of employee retention during the downturn. So it's very, very important to understand your employees do have concerns and fears, and you need to address those proactively and be transparent. 3rd, we found that remote work is possible. It's not only possible, it can actually be effective and productive. And so we really understand a new chapter in how business transactions can occur. We found out that technology can be of great help, done right, of course. I mean, how many a year ago even heard of the term Zoom, or how many have ever done a Teams meeting? I think we've done Skype occasionally, but it really elevated the utilization of technology to make our business operations much more efficient. And once we're through this pandemic, we need to continue to leverage those technology resources to make our businesses even more successful. We have found that education and information dissemination can be improved. Getting information out, even with all of our technology and all of our communication tools, there was still, I believe, a lack of communicating quality and timely information to those that needed it. 6, we realize our supply chains are very vulnerable. For most business sectors, you need to understand that and the logistics that's necessary to fill your needs, and make sure you have plans, and recognize that the way other businesses are impacted will likely have an impact on your businesses. You know, manufacturing was disrupted because of stay-at-home orders, so materials weren't able to be produced. Imports were impacted because of worker shortages at point of entries. Transportation was impacted, lack of drivers, lack of hotels, lack of restaurants where they can meet their daily needs. And then, of course, the retail and service industry sectors were impacted because those supply chains couldn't be met. You couldn't get the product that you needed. I mean, who would have envisioned that a pandemic would cause a shortage of toilet paper and hand sanitizer and pork and chicken and eggs? I mean, the response to the pandemic really showed some vulnerabilities in our supply chain, and we always need to be thinking about how we can make that far more robust. I do think that one of the things that we did observe during the recent pandemic is there was volumes of data out there, volumes of information, but wasn't necessarily useful information. You need to find information that will help you adapt, help you improve, help you maximize your success. And at MarksNelson, we try to do that for our clients. We try to make sure we take that volume of data that's out there and boil it down into very meaningful bites of information that they can immediately deploy and produce a return to their business or to their community. I would encourage you, if you're looking for some resources, please visit our website. It's there on the screen, marksnelsonCPA.com. We've got a COVID-19 resources page. We've got technology briefs. We've got insights into specific industries and trends. So I would encourage you to visit our site. Feel free to subscribe for our email updates. There's no cost for that. Just put your email information in there, and we'll send you information out that we believe is timely for many of our businesses and communities to access. And of course, if you do have questions, I'd encourage you to reach out to myself, to Chris, to any member of our team, and we'd be happy to try to identify some resources that can help you be successful in the event of the next economic disruption. So I want to just kind of end by saying thank you for the opportunity to have this discussion with you today. My hope is at least there's one point that you were able to take out of there and take it back and immediately implement it to make yourself a little bit more resilient for the next possible disruption. I believe we are a great nation made up of great communities, populated by great people. I believe they will rise to this occasion to recover from this disruption and fuel a very robust recovery. So let's continue to support one another, encourage one another, so we have the quality of life that we all desire here in our local communities. So I welcome any questions in the time remaining, and I'll turn it back over to Keith to kind of lead the question and answer session.
Thanks, Steve. Yes, you're right. We are all in this together. So, you know, it's all of us working together that can get through this. So thank you very much for that great information. I have a couple questions, but want to remind folks, go ahead and type in your questions into the question chat box, and we'll kind of shift through those. The first question, Steve, is very relevant to what's happening right now, as we're seeing an uptick in cases that are happening across the country, but also here in Missouri. What would you identify as one or two of the most important things that either an organization or a business should be doing now to be ready for what we don't know is coming?
Yeah, I don't want to sound like a broken record, but I would say educate and communicate. Make sure you're working and talking with your local health authorities and health advisors to understand not only where we've been, but what the current status is and what it is trending. So you can make an informed decision. So you can know how to respond in a way that's beneficial not only for your business, but for your community. So educate yourself on what's going on, communicate with those that's in the position to know what's kind of going on behind the scenes so you can act knowledgeably.
Okay. You mentioned business preparedness and understanding the vendors and the supply chain. I drive by the local Chevy dealership here in Excelsior Springs, and there are 4 pickup trucks in the parking lot. I mean, normally it is just covered with pickup trucks. So, you know, understanding those supply chains, but as a small business, if I'm looking at the products I'm selling in my shop, do you have any advice on, you know, is it that connection to the vendor that you're working with, or is it looking at your product mix? How would you advise small businesses to be thinking about, you know, as they're thinking about fall and winter or Christmas inventory, what should they be doing?
I think that's an excellent question. And I think there's certain things they could be doing to kind of prepare themselves. One is recognize what is it that they need to have on their shelf for resale and who's supplying that, and what are my alternatives to that supply. So really look and see now, before you get into that busy season, who has product that I need that I can get into my store by the time that I need it. The second thing I would really encourage businesses to do is understand the origin of the products you're selling. I do believe there's going to be an increase in the demand for American-made products. They don't want to be vulnerable to imports and exports like we have been. So look and see if there's a domestic provider of that product that you are selling that you can place in your store and you can market it as made in the USA. Mm-hmm. I think that's going to be a consumer trend that we will see reinforced in the coming months.
Okay. You talked about insurance and looking at the cost benefit analysis. How do you go about that? You know, I understand insurance. It's an insurance salesman or salesperson for a reason. So how do you do that cost benefit analysis? What's your recommendation?
And I'm not an insurance expert, and I try to avoid areas where I don't feel confident. I would go back to something I stated earlier. You need to find a knowledgeable and trusted advisor that can help you not only understand what's covered, but to the degree in which that coverage is provided and what that cost will be. Then you can take that information and you can work, you know, through a financial model to say, is my risk of exposure, you know, greater than the cost of this premium, and just do a financial cost benefit analysis of that. But you need to find somebody that's not selling you a policy, but is coaching and advising you on your insurance coverages.
And it's also understanding your current policy, right? What things are included and are not included.
Yeah, we had a number of businesses that we reached out to post-COVID. They were a little shocked to find out that they were not covered under business interruption insurances because of COVID, because their policy did not cover civil authority. So this was an issue where there was a stay-at-home order. Restaurants, barbershops, gyms, salons were all closed by civil authority. So that was the disruption, but that was not a covered event under certain policies. So people were very disappointed in their business interruption. So really understand what is covered under those interruption cases.
Right. I remember the tornado in Jefferson City, which is my hometown, wiped out a car dealership in Jefferson City. And I remember reading the newspaper articles that the gentleman, the owner, was, you know, taking care of his employees, even though the whole dealership had been destroyed. But that was one thing he felt was very important, was being able to pay his employees through that. And he made sure that he was covered with that through his insurance. Yeah. Chris, I have a question for you since you're on the CPA side. You know, we do have some small businesses that are listening and watching today. As people are ending their PPP and working on closing those out, do you have any tips or best practices that they should be adhering to as they're moving through this?
Well, we had recommended all along to our clients that you open a separate bank account and put those PPP funds in there to begin with, and keep that very separate from everything else. And that made it much easier for you to account for anything that you were getting reimbursed for on those. There's a number of worksheets out there that assist you in accounting for that, and all the different forms and things like that. Happy to send something along, a link to someone if they have a specific question about that. But keeping it separate and well accounted for is the most important thing. And make sure that you are following what the current guidelines are. There's been a number of changes through the program. Make sure you know what applies to your particular situation. Because you know, it's changed 3 or 4 times here, and new guidance keeps coming out. So
yeah, that was going to be my question. So let's say you applied under one set of guidelines and they've changed those guidelines. Are those retroactive, that you're now under the new guidelines and things have changed? How does that work?
You need to read carefully what it says, and maybe Steve's want to respond to that particularly, but each program has different things, and sometimes it's retroactive and sometimes it may not be. So you just have to carefully read what you signed up for, and really it's between you and your bank that you got the PPP funds from. If you have a direct SBA thing, that's, you know, you need to watch their guidelines, but work with your bank or your lender. They're the ones who have to be the reporting group there. So check in with them. Your banker is very important here.
And Keith, just to add to that, a best practice that I've seen from a couple of businesses is they've started creating a journal to go with their PPP, because they recognize if in the event that the SBA or the IRS or whoever comes out and monitors this program or audits this program, it may be months or years down the road, and it's going to be really difficult to recall with any clarity what happened in February of 2020 or March of 2020.
Right.
They're creating a journal of, this was the economic conditions that we were experiencing at the point of applying for PPP, and this is what we are experiencing with those PPP funds, and this is how we used it. So it's not just the financial records, it's kind of that narrative of the justification of why you needed that program. Make a record of it, put it with those financial records, so you have it just in case you would need it.
That's a great tip, because, you know, you're also trying to run your business and keep people employed, and, you know, figure out safety protocols and all those things that you're not going to remember. What was I doing in, you know, on April 15th when I issued this check using these PPP funds? And so that's a great piece of advice. And you mentioned earlier too, Steve, in the community preparedness, identifying the vulnerable as you're thinking about your emergency planning. And that kind of resonated with me because, you know, as we moved through this, lots of decisions were made by government officials and different entities. And all those decisions had different ramifications. And, you know, as you looked back at that, you're like, you know, there weren't any good decisions to be made as we moved through this when we were shutting down the economy and closing schools. And so I would imagine it's important to have various people at the table as you're determining those vulnerabilities and making those decisions. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you need all perspectives.
Because you think about, you know, when schools were closed down, you know, it seems like a simple decision, you know, and when you close one day for a snow day, it's different than closing school down for 2 months. And parents with childcare who now the facilities for childcare are not open either. And parents are now at home, but still having to work. And then you think about food security. There are just a lot of things went into that decision. And so as a community, I would imagine it's having all those people around the table so you could make those best decisions. And we've heard instances of those where you know, the community was staying in touch with its key leaders in various organizations, and they seem to weather the storm much better.
Yeah, I believe it's very easy to see those communities that had businesses and citizens engaged and those that didn't. You can kind of see how they're resilient and flexible during this, and they're coming out of it a little bit quicker than those that were all acting independently without any community cohesiveness.
Right. And, you know, from Missouri Main Street's perspective, we've been working with FEMA and the state emergency folks on helping create resilient communities, because FEMA has learned through its disasters that a more resilient community bounces back much quicker than one that doesn't have a plan at all. And so I think that's the whole message of why we wanted to bring this presentation to everyone today is, sure, we're in the middle of a crisis, we're in the middle of a pandemic, but it's helping us learn and make that plan for the next time so that we're better suited and make better decisions in the future. Any final words from Steve?
No, I wish you all well in this recovery. Please don't forget, as we kind of come out, plan for the next one. Please make sure you do all the post-disruption activities that we've suggested so you're prepared, because just because you've experienced one disruption doesn't mean that's all you're going to experience. There's oftentimes a chain of these. So just be prepared as best you can.
Right. Chris?
Absolutely. Well, I'm just delighted to be here this morning and share this great information. Steve, thank you so much for your time and helping us. And Keith and Gayla, always a pleasure to work with you on anything that we do. I so enjoy being part of the Missouri Main Street Connections Board of Directors and look forward for lots of good stuff we're working on in the future. And just best wishes to everybody out there. We'll get through this.
Great. Well, Chris, I want to thank you too. I know you've participated in a lot of our webinars as we've gone through this, so it's great to see you on the other side of it, helping us bring this presentation to the recipients today. So thanks a lot for that.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Steve, I took lots of notes. Hey, MMSC has some work to do ourselves, so thank you very much. We really, really appreciate it. So everyone out there, have a great day. Please join us again on August 5th for our next Mornings on Main. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.